Hello and welcome to the Product Shipping Forecast, where we help you navigate the treacherous waters of product development. I'm Rob, a product designer at Zero Height, and I'm joined by my co-host and product engineering colleague, Rosie.
Hi.
I just lost my notes.
Oh no. Best start. First episode, starting strong.
There we go. On this episode, we're going to be diving deep into the topic of handoff, a long-standing topic, I think, when it comes to how designers and developers work together. And it's something I think that teams are always trying to improve, whether that's through changes in process or adopting tools to make handoff easier. And also with Figma's recent addition of dev mode, it's become a bit of a hot topic once again. So we thought it'd be a great first topic for our podcast to really dive into. So I guess to open up the conversation, Rosie, I'm interested from your perspective as a developer, like what makes effective handoff?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to it, and I tried to think of sort of one small phrase that would like summarize it really well. I think the one that I came to was not being surprised, which sounds quite generic, but having worked with like a variety of different designers, the times that handoff has been the most effective is when somebody passes me a file, be that a Figma file, and I can open it and know exactly what's going to be there. And that sort of comes in lots of different formats. So a big part of that is something that feels really basic, but it's something like consistent design layouts. It's like, I know, Rob, that if I open one of your designs, I know which parts are like completely ready and done and I can start working on versus which parts are old explorations you've done, things that are being reviewed by the rest of the design team. And so I can still click around and see those things, understand sort of the direction you're going, but I'm not lost as to which bits I, as a developer, actually need to care about. I think there's, also the other parts in terms of like easy to follow flows. So I think especially with some of the features that we've been building at the moment, it's not just like, here's one screen, make it. It's sort of like, actually, we're looking to build out this full feature flow. How's the user going to get from one end to another? And I know that I can open one of your Figma files and be like, oh, okay, cool, this screen, this screen, this screen, including all like the happy and sad parts, which I think are easy to miss off sometimes, and like we definitely do. But when they're there, I always know how to look for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I know that I've sort of been playing around with how we map out those flows a little bit recently, particularly I think when you have much more complex flows that can have kind of branching paths and, as you say, trying to cover off like where something goes wrong. We've always kind of struggled a bit with, how to kind of capture that without doubling up the amount of work that's required to kind of get that across. And so we've been trying a few different things about just better wayfinding in those kind of handoff files to indicate, okay, you've reached the end of this part of the flow. Here's your decision tree where to go next. Because I think in the past we've always tried to have everything mapped from end to end, and that just becomes really sort of chaotic to keep on top of.
Yeah, you definitely start to lose track of like which parts do I need to rebuild and which parts are actually just reusing a screen from over there. And we've definitely ended up in some funny loops before. But yeah, more recently, like the way you've pulled out like certain states of components, you're sort of like, on this page you'll use, this sort of like card component, and then here's the like 3 different states that card could have based on what the user's done. And I found that has been so easy to then implement because I can actually, you're almost doing half the job of a developer saying like, this is an individual component and you need to build it to have these 3 states. And I'm like, cool, great. I can do that piece of work as like an individual piece. And then I can put it in the actual user flow later on. So yeah, that's definitely one of the things I think has been really great. I think like another thing around consistency is the use of tokens and or variables, which we're in a lovely halfway point of. But knowing that I can click on like a text element and it's got some sort of class on it that tells me like it's like body medium or heading large, and knowing that at the moment that directly correlates with what's in the code, so I know exactly what to write. And I think we have a few inconsistencies still where some things like our colors, right? At the moment, we know we're kind of slightly off the mark where it comes to some colors match perfectly with the code and other colors. It's more like, oh, I know historically that actually the sort of the background subtle isn't background subtle in the code. It's actually background white. And then you sort of have to make this internal mapping, which is, yeah, less ideal. But on the whole, knowing that when I click on things, I can directly relate that to the code makes the handoff so much easier, because I don't then have to question why a font size is different or why a color might be different. That's super easy.
Yeah, but that said, you're also very good at pushing back when I forget to apply a color style or a text style to stuff.
Yeah, or something's 1 pixel off, and I'm like, Rob, we work in divisible by 4, and this seems to be 17 pixels. And you're like, yes, I know. But yeah, I think you are right that like we're quite lucky here that we can sort of just ping you on a comment in Figma and be like, Rob, what is this? And you'll get back to us pretty quickly, which definitely makes it easier, because I think when you've got a bigger barrier in communication, it's definitely harder to have like effective handoff.
Yeah, and obviously like the tooling helps a lot with that. Obviously we do a lot of our handoff in Figma, and so that has all of the kind of layer styles and variables applied, so it's super easy to do that. But then also Figma does have those drawbacks. I'm sure like designers who work in Figma and work with text in particular know that if you start modifying something by bolding a single word or underlining something to indicate it's a link, it removes all of the styles. So it immediately is just like, am I meant to make these separate text layers? Because that's going to be impossible to start making this look right. And I think at that point, it does become a bit more about like actually making sure you can still communicate that stuff and just have trust that, the rules are established enough that people know like, oh, this is probably going to be body medium. This is probably going to be, this kind of spacing and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely easier when you're sort of a smaller team that's worked together for a long time and you have an understanding of what the rules are. I do think as soon as you start to sort of grow and expand and be onboarding new people all the time, it can definitely be harder to convey those messages, for sure. I think, that also kind of comes down to like my other like sort of final point around like what's effective handoff is like using common components. So I know with your designs you try and remember what we've used before, and also we have some design system elements and try to make the most use of those versus always making sort of unique components for absolutely every design. And then we kind of follow the similar thing in the code base, but there's definitely this slightly misty layer in the middle, where we don't always know if something's going to be used multiple times. And I think because we sometimes favor like speed over longevity, we don't always make our components reusable. And then sometimes there's a point where you're like, oh, we've made this before. And then we have to go back as devs and be like, cool, time to make that a generic component so we can reuse it. But I think once we've then made it a nice generic like component, it's really easy when you're sort of like, cool, reuse the oversized button component here, here, and here. And then all of a sudden it becomes much quicker for us to take it from like design to development.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, it's sort of veering a little bit away from handoff, but I think that question about like when do you see something that is being made in a design and go, this could actually be reused, maybe we need to think about that, because I think that is still part of the conversation of like, how do you build something, like how do you take this design idea to reality? Like, are there patterns, are there new components you could be creating out of this? And I think it's definitely something we haven't properly nailed down yet, and I think it's something that also we're sort of conscious of in the design team. We're having conversations about how we get better at identifying like what should be a pattern and how we make sure others in the team can make use of that as well. So
yeah, no, I think there's a lot more to dive into on that another day for sure. Are there sort of anything else that you find helpful in terms of handoff on it when it comes to us?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I'm quite lucky, and I think that most of the engineers that use Zero Height, and particularly the engineers I've worked with in my time at Zero Height, tend to be quite Figma literate. And they have familiarity with using the tool. They know how to kind of navigate around it. They understand, things like layer styles and variables. Partly because it's something that we have to like integrate with as part of our product. So that makes it really easy to have a much more light touch handoff, I think. I think it's interesting when in previous roles I've had where engineers maybe haven't spent as much time in design tools. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to train people in how to read a Figma file, because I think whilst it's super useful for designers to just design something, put it in an area and go, here you go build. There was obviously benefits, I think, to some of the older tools like Zeppelin that would give you a much more specific area on like how you can actually dig into getting measurements and knowing that something was kind of locked down as a design.
Yeah, I think there's definitely sort of an area of that. I know I wasn't at all Figma literate before I came here. I used to kind of just get sent very flat designs, and I just kind of look at them, and you'd kind of half guess, and you'd be like, yeah, that's close. Or you'd be sat next to the designer and going, is this right? Whereas like I came here and I feel like I've bugged you with a lot of questions, and you've just taught me like simple shortcuts. So now I'm like, oh, I can click on two components and see the like distance between them. Great. Or like understanding when a component's sort of being used from the design system in terms of the design, and then I can go, oh, that means we probably already have it in the code. Great. That's how I dig into that, versus being like, is this new or is this not? And having to sort of go around in Storybook and try and work it all out. So yeah, I think that definitely is a big plus, because I feel like, yeah, as you say, all the engineers here are quite Figma literate, which is a really nice bonus.
Yeah, and I think we also work to sort of very early on establish some like just general like base rules for how handoff works. I think all designers in the company kind of have this concept of a like developer ready area, like usually a page in their file that is like, when something is actually ready to be picked up and built in a sprint, it goes on that page. And so everything else can kind of then be clearly labeled as like, this is the messy exploration area. This is, the review area where you're getting feedback. This maybe is where you're kind of putting prototypes so that people can see how that thing's constructed, but then also, launch that prototype and actually play around with it. So I think even just having some of those basic rules, like they're not the sort of thing that people often think about when it comes to handoff, because people just think about the actual like, how far is this button from this form field? What kind of size button are we using? Are we using the small, the secondary, that sort of thing? But actually just having like the process stuff around it, is really, really helpful. We added in kind of like annotation tools as well into our stuff in terms of like labeling up, this is what this flow represents. This is a particular screen and maybe the things to consider here. Just having those kind of light touch things that mean you can also answer questions before they're kind of like, prompted to you via Slack or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. I also think making good use of the Figma comments is good. But especially because we kind of let them live there. It's one of the things that we've never really discussed, but I feel like we do, which is that even if a question's resolved, we don't necessarily get rid of the comment. And I think it's kind of good in a way to track the history of like, hey, I've questioned what this button should look like if it's disabled, for example. And you'd be like, here you go, this is what it should do. And then rather than being like, cool, Rosie knows now, hide, we sort of let them live there, which I think means that other people can go along and get the context or ask follow-on questions. It's kind of a controversial thing.
I mean, you say that, but I do go through and resolve comments.
No, Rob, my comments. You must do them after I finish looking at the file.
It's usually like I go through towards the end of a project and just kind of like remove stuff. Or if I'm kind of like coming back to something, because for me, comments like a really great way of like noting like this is the thing I need to focus on. But once I know it's been done, it's been built, it's been dealt with, I can clear that off a little bit.
I guess there's also I don't know how much you use them, because again, I never look at them, but there's like the in production page, which I guess is probably like what you want as a clean design. Whereas I only ever look at the dev ready stuff. I sometimes look at your explorations just out of interest, but yeah.
I'm very sorry that you looked through my explorations.
They're good, they're interesting.
It's damning with faint praise there.
Well, was there anything else you wanted to cover on what you find useful?
No, I think that kind of covers a lot of it. I guess we sort of touched a little bit on tooling, so I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on that. Because as you say, you hadn't really used Figma prior to working at Zero Height, and that is the main tool we use for handoff. Yeah, I guess in terms of tools you've used in the past, in terms of what we use right now, how do you think that helps the process?
I think one of the things I find most helpful about the way that we now do it is sort of like prototyping. So quite often I sort of said like I get like very flat designs. They'd be like, I want the page to look like this. And you'd kind of have to make a lot of assumptions about how the interactions would work, how things would look, what would happen when you clicked on certain buttons, how it like expansion worked. And you would generally get it right, but there would often then be this sort of back and forth in the QA stage where people would be like, oh no, I was expecting it to do this, or it doesn't quite look right on mobile versus desktop. And you'd kind of end up in this weird back and forth that didn't really feel like your fault because you were just doing what you thought would be the right thing. Whereas the way that we use prototyping in Figma really helps because actually I can click through the flow and see what should happen and see the different states that I can end up in. And it just really helps to like visualize it and be like, okay, this is actually what should happen. I also think it potentially like gives a better route for me to give feedback because I feel like I can understand it better and actually go, this probably wouldn't flow that well, or like because obviously at the moment we're working on like developer focused features. I can also give feedback in terms of like, as a developer, I wouldn't expect that to happen if I clicked on that button. I would be expecting something else. And it just sort of brings it to life, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about like prototyping and seeing how like the interactions flow, how things kind of pop in, how loading states kind of work. Because I think one of the challenges I find with handoff tools is they tend to be quite static.
Yes.
It is about, here is this screen, it is this particular state, this is what it looks like. And I know, we talk about it at Zero Height, we talked about it in like every design team I've ever been in, which is like, how do you get more sort of delight into an experience? How do you bring in, animation? How do you use motion and movement to kind of cover loading or just create a really like slick experience? And I don't think any of the handoff tools really kind of capture that properly. It still requires a lot of like, okay, I've got to go build a prototype to kind of show what I'm trying to get across with this. Or I have to go off and use, I haven't used it for years, but something like Principle or like an animation tool to actually mock something up and go, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And even then it's still kind of like, I feel like you can communicate the vibe of a thing. Maybe you could start to get into like, talking about like easing in, easing out and, testing Bezier curves, but it's still, there's a lot more back and forth, I think, about that sort of stuff. And it ends up feeling like that stuff then gets deprioritized because it's harder to hand off. Than...
I think definitely like the smaller animations, I know sort of within our team specifically, we come back around to them all the time because we like the idea of things feeling really polished and feeling like we've really like thought about every detail. And yeah, you're right that like prototyping definitely misses the finer details. And I think us as devs, we kind of make assumptions. We're like, oh yeah, a little transition would be nice here. It'd be nice if that faded in or out. And we just kind of do it. But that probably isn't the best way to go about it. And it would be nice if there was a good way to do it. And I don't think Figma necessarily solves that at the moment, especially because the way we have to implement transitions, I don't think is particularly like that well annotated by Figma. Because at the moment, like obviously because we're using like tokens for like typography and colors and stuff, it's very easy to be like, yes, cool, those match up really well. Something like an animation doesn't necessarily, because there are so many different ways to do it, and it depends on how you're implementing it in your own site. So yeah, I think it could be improved. I think it's good, and I think it's helpful prototyping, but yeah, I don't think it's like fully solved. I guess are there any other sort of bits of tooling that you find really helpful or not so helpful?
Yeah, I think there's like a bunch of tools out there that I would really like to bring into the process a bit more. I think Michelle, one of our design advocates, did a accessibility workshop with us, I think last year. And as part of that, kind of shared a sort of accessibility annotation like kit that's a sort of Figma community project file, and that was really interesting for just kind of like encouraging you to think more about how do you make something accessible outside of just like color contrast. Thinking about focus orders, thinking about alt text for things. I'd love to start to bring that in a bit more. I think it is something that a lot of teams do typically forget about. Accessibility is important, but it's always that thing that seems to get deprioritized. And I think tools like that can really help to make it a bit easier to get started with moving down that process, and actually, yeah, making it part of the actual handoff process rather than you do an accessibility audit every couple of years and go, oh, we need to go fix these things.
Yeah, I think we try our best from a developer side to sort of have things in place that make you go, oh yeah, have I made that accessible? But as you say, there's more to it than just sort of like adding a label onto a button or whatever it may be. I think it's actually about how you're designing, and yeah, as you say, it needs to kind of like start with you and then be handed over to us to actually put across. So yeah, I think that would be really cool, and I think it's the sort of thing we're probably going to look at as we keep going at Zero Height. I know it sort of keeps coming back round that it would be really nice to focus on, and I'd love the idea of sort of diving into that a bit more.
I guess, like, from your perspective, is there anything that you would like to be more of a part of the handoff process?
Right now, I can selfishly say no. There's definitely things that I think I would like advocate for other teams to do. Like, I think we're quite lucky in that I don't feel like you just turn up and go, hey, here's a design, and we'll go, oh, what? Like, we always make sure to sort of like start with the user flow, right? Like, that's something that I've never really done before and is really helpful. So just sitting down like one designer, one developer, and just going, hey, I'm expecting the user to start here and then end up at here, and here are all the stages we see in between. And at that point, they don't have a design. I can somewhat envision roughly where we're going to end up because I've been here now for a few years, but then you turn around and go, here's this magical thing. But I never feel shocked when you turn around and give us your design because we've talked about it so much. And then I think it's the other thing is sort of like how you're delivering the design, right? Like Looms or any other recording software, not sponsored, are really helpful because it means you can actually talk through why you've done things rather than just being like, here's a Figma file, go make it. And me having to be like, oh, why have you like forced them to go through a 2-step flow versus just like making it all on one page? Instead, you actually talk through it and go, this is the reason behind this. This bit I'm not so sure about. So, give me direct feedback if you think it's wrong. This bit's completely done. This bit I'm still tweaking. And it means that I'm probably spending about the same amount of time consuming it. It's only a few minutes. But rather than having to work it out and assume what you're trying to get across to me, I can instead sort of be like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense as to why you've done it that way. Or actually, I'm not sure I agree with that. So I'll just reply on Slack and be like, have we thought about doing this? And then you can have a conversation about it rather than feeling like you're treading on someone's toes by making a suggestion.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of that is part of the benefit of we work in cross-functional squads in Zero Height, right? So we have a bunch of engineers, we have a product designer, we have a product manager, all kind of focused around a theme. So you can build up that kind of like working rapport over several weeks, months, as you're kind of developing out a feature from an idea, from a problem to like, okay, we're handing this off. So I think that definitely helps the handoff process because we always try and bring everyone in that squad along that journey at the same time. But I'm interested, like, I don't know much about kind of where you've worked at previously, but has that kind of always been the case, or have you had more of that distance between design and development, and how have you then managed the handoff there?
Yes, I've definitely had a lot more distance. I think it wasn't until I got into startups that sort of designers were a lot more like shared like a shared resource. I hate the word resource for people, but it's what they used to call it. It's like, oh, it's a shared resource. And you're like, they're people. But, you'd have one designer that's trying to help sort of 4 or 5 teams. And I think in some ways they were like weird pros because the designs would all be very consistent, like across all of the features done by different teams. Because it's done by one person, they'd be very, very consistent, which is great. But it would really make the communication hard. There'd be a sense of sort of they're not aware what the individual teams need in terms of sort of like priorities, timelines, where they're at. And then also there's the sort of that they're so busy that they can't immediately respond. And so it sort of becomes really difficult to have a feedback loop. Your feedback loop then ends up being over days versus being sort of essentially minutes where you're like, hey, look, at the moment I'm chucking a screenshot and I'm like, Rob, this looks disgusting. What should I do? And you can be like, oh, just fix this. I'm like, nice. Whereas it sort of used to be like, oh, hey, when I've implemented it, it doesn't look right. And then I sort of wait a full day and then there'd be some suggestion back and you keep trying and it would really slow things down and make things difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never had that. Well, I have in a few cases had the scenario where I've been like a designer across multiple teams. It's often been a temporary thing. Maybe a subject for another episode. But what I have had is, even in cross-functional squads I've worked in the past, having people sort of located elsewhere. I've worked with developers who are based in Canada, developers who are based in Poland, and having that time difference and even sometimes a language barrier just means that it becomes so much more important as part of the handoff to like over document. Like one of the things I love is like, don't have to document that much on our side because we can have these conversations, we can tie it to Figma comments. But as you say, when that communication is happening, maybe with a 6-hour time difference, maybe when someone can only get to it a couple of days later, it slows everything down. And so getting more of that stuff documented up front helps to remove some of those barriers and helps to remove some of that interpretation that can come through when you're just presented with, a design in, Figma, in Zeppelin, and essentially letting the developer kind of, click through and figure out like, okay, this is 16 pixels from this, and this is using a 24 pixel font weight or whatever.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more time consuming. And I think that's even from the developer side because you have to do so much working out, even if it's really well documented. I think the other thing it leaves some room for is sort of the too many cooks problem. Sometimes when you don't necessarily have that constant communication, other people will then potentially jump in because they want to try and solve the problem because, you don't necessarily want to wait for a whole nother day for whoever it is, be the designer or developer, to reply. And so you end up with other people jumping in, and then all of a sudden you've sort of got too many people solving one problem, and then you no longer sort of know who you should be listening to, what you should be doing, and everyone kind of gets confused, and the whole sort of like scope bloats just completely unproportionate. And it's, I think that's definitely another one to add to the list of not ideal stuff.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point when it comes to, people in the process who might sit outside of design development. In a previous job, we had QA engineers in our team, and so the process was a lot more rigid in terms of, design would get handed off, a developer would pick that up, work on that design. It would then go to the QA team, who would also have access to Zeppelin, and they'd be doing a comparison and checking like, not just does this thing work as intended, but does it match the designs?
Yeah.
And I'm sure lots of designers who work in fairly agile environments, will be familiar with, things change, right? Like a developer picks something up, we realize maybe there's a better solution, we have a component that does something similar, why don't we use that? Or we've realized that, this thing that we thought might take a long time doesn't take as long as it did. And so we change things around, and that doesn't always then get updated in the design specs. And having that kind of handoff process meant that the QAs were kicking stuff back to
Yeah.
developers saying, this doesn't pass, like doesn't match the designs, even though there'd been that agreement. And so I think that is often the problem of like needing to also think about who the other audience is of this that might need to stay in the loop around those things as well.
Yeah. Did you ever feel like you found sort of like good solutions to keeping sort of like third parties in the loop around it, or is it always kind of a bit of a battle?
It's a bit of a battle. I think in the like one thing was just like actually getting the QAs to speak to designers as well. I think that was a big change, was just actually breaking the process a little bit to say like, hey, you don't just need to interact with the engineers. Like if you do have questions, you can go to the designers and just check, because they hadn't previously been speaking to us. So that was really useful. We actually at one point, because we were working on a product that we were sort of working on something that we were trying to launch for the first time. So we didn't have a product out there, and things were often constantly in flux. We had different squads working on different parts of the product. So we actually ended up making this component that was an out of scope kind of like banner, and we would just kind of like slap it over the designs. So we'd have like an app UI, and we just like, you know, slap an out of scope thing over, say, the tab bar, just to be clear that like if something has changed in here, you can ignore it because that's not what we're looking at as part of this. We're interested in this part. And it's a little bit of overkill, but I think that like really like communication between different squads wasn't great. And just again, like we were located in different offices, so having that just really blunt clarity of like, this is what you need to look at as part of this work. This stuff is, you know, context to show how it fits in the screen, but it is not the thing that you need to be reworking. Because again, like that is often a bit of a challenge, is like if you're presented with, you know, an app UI screen, are you building everything on there? Are you changing anything? Like it's really hard to call out like what specifically you need to focus on, but you still need, you know, just putting that form field in a Figma file and going, cool, build this form and put it on a page, is also not the right way, because it's out of context. Like how big is that on the screen? Like
what does it look like if it's mobile? What does it? No, absolutely. I think it's very hard to find a middle ground, and I think we do it all the time now, and it's just at the moment we're lucky that it's very easy to have a conversation, and so I can just be like, am I changing this? Like I know quite often for us it's things like icons. I sometimes just the other day you use an icon and I was like, that icon is pink in our code base at the moment. Do you want me to change it? Should it be black? Should it be pink? I'm not sure. And yeah, like we were quite lucky that it was a very easy and quick conversation for us to have, but trying to find ways to do that with teams that are split across time zones, or when it's maybe not a developer who, you know, feels like they can easily talk to a designer, but maybe someone else. I think it's definitely much harder to do. Were there any other thoughts you had on handoff?
I actually, just going back to the too many cooks thing, have you ever worked with multiple designers on a project?
Oh, have I ever? Kind of. It's one where it's sort of, you start with one designer and they hand something over. So you get going on it and it's all good. And then for some reason they disappear, be it like a long holiday or something else. And they're like, oh, don't worry, you can just communicate with this person instead. And all of a sudden you realize they have a completely different idea, or they have no clue why that design's that way, because they've just been so far removed. And I don't know, it's hard because I don't necessarily know the inner workings of like design teams, but I know sort of as developers, there's this whole big thing of making sure that we're constantly keeping other developers up to date. So in case like we're ill, or the common phrase of getting hit by a bus, somebody else knows what I'm working on and therefore knows what I'm doing. And in the past, I've definitely had a few experiences where I've gone from one designer to another and all of a sudden it's just completely different. They're like, no, I wouldn't do it that way. You need to change it to this. And you're like, You're like, I don't know whether or not to listen to you. Yeah, I haven't experienced that in a while, and I don't really know. I guess you're going to be off in a few weeks. I'm hoping nobody turns around and tells us to change all the designs.
Yeah, I don't know how we'll handle that. I guess something to think about. Yeah, I was asking because I think, yeah, that thing of a designer starting something and then another designer picking it up, I think is an interesting challenge, particularly because I think what a lot of handoff tools aren't good at is intent. They're great at like, this is what this thing looks like, but not, and here is why. Like,
Yeah.
here is the decisions that led to doing it this way, or it's been designed this way based on these assumptions, which once the developer looks at something might not be true, and might you might be able to change something because that thing is based on assumption that actually now we go, oh, we can actually do this. Like that API calls not super quick, so we could get that information for you. That sort of stuff I don't think is very well captured.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely interesting because obviously I know you sort of have like design crit where you show other designers sort of what you've built, and I don't know how much you go into the sort of why in that. But then, yeah, I know we have lots of conversations and go, oh, actually, can you change that? And then, yeah, that doesn't, it might be very unclear why your explorations have gone from sort of like one flow and then all of a sudden in your dev ready, it's just something completely different. And it's because you've sat down and had a conversation with the developer and we've gone, no, that's not possible. And you've had to go, okay, let me try again. And I guess, yeah, that's where the dev handoff's really easy between sort of like one designer and the developers they're used to working with, but doesn't necessarily work when you start then switching who the designer is that you're trying to work with.
Yeah.
Sort of picking up halfway is very difficult. I think maybe less so in the other direction. I think if it was the same designer who suddenly had to switch engineering team, I think it would be easier, because I think with the designer being essentially the source of truth when it comes to why something looks that way, it's much easier for developers to go, cool, this bit's been built, I've got this next bit, and I have the original designer to ask all the questions to. But maybe not.
Yeah, I guess in that scenario, it would be the same as like, if you switch companies, right? You need to figure out like, what does that developer team need to implement something effectively. And I think even within the same company, we try and obviously design ops, DevOps is all about trying to make these kind of processes be more standard across an org. We are people, right? And people have different ways of doing stuff. People have different ways that they can understand, intent, and just know how to implement something. And so I think it's always about that case whenever you're interacting with a new team, figuring out what their needs are and how you can most effectively communicate that, because that is what handoff is really at the core. It's about communicating like, this is the design, how do we make that real?
Yeah I think that's where, like, to kind of go a bit slightly off piece, but that's where like actually having like our like weekly sprint meetings, and I've done it before where it's sort of the sprint planning part has just been like developers and product managers, because product managers care about what we're doing and the developers are the ones sort of planning how we do it. And you could just kind of like put the designer and you don't involve them. Sure, like it's fine, they'll just give us the designs. Whereas actually having you in the meeting and being able to be like, just call on you and be like, is this design ready? Is this the right way to break it down? Like, have we covered off the whole flow? Like, do you see a bit that's missing? Is really helpful to have you in that like early communication versus just sort of having you come in at the end and be like, you've missed off this whole section here where somebody doesn't know what they're doing and ends up on an error page. And we're like, oh,
yeah. It's really funny you mentioned that, because like that was something I learned like really early in my career, was like one of the first like in-house sort of product design roles I had. The way that it worked was the design team would like be assigned to an engineering squad, but everything would go via a PM. And so we would like build out wireframes, we'd have UI designs, we'd have the flows, and then a PM would like take it to the engineers and talk through like, now build this thing. And we would get stuff back to review as designers, and we would be like, oh my God, it's all wrong. In any of the design patterns whatsoever. And a big change for that was actually just, I don't between like design and development, and actually just having designers and developers talk to one another directly, just fix that massively. So that's partly why I'm always very like, even though I get questions like, do you need to be in like a, you know, a couple of hours every week to like do like planning and retro and sprint review? And I'm like, yeah, because like that is for me part of like establishing the good handoff, is to know like where everything is at, either from the design side or from the engineering side, and get to see that in progress, like get to see demos of stuff that's being built at the same time. So
yeah, and definitely like seeing you know, when at the beginning of the sprint planning, you know, obviously we'll demo like, hey, this is the engineering work we've done last week, like this is where we're at, so that, you know, you and Nick, our PM, know where we're at. And then it's really nice for you to be like, cool, this is where I'm at on this design, and this is what I'm working on this week. And that is like, I think it's definitely part of the dev handover that I think is potentially underrated, is the before you've done the design, like before you finished it, so that we know when you're going to finish it. So you're like, I am working on this design this week. And we're like, cool.
yeah,
So that means that for next sprint, we can start working on that because Rob is looking at it this week. And it makes it so much easier for us to plan out our work and how to break it all down and how to do it. And so, yeah, like, I don't think I could go back to not having like the designer I'm working with in my sprint meetings. Even if half the time you get distracted when we're talking about API calls, and you drift off into the distance before we're like, Rob, please come back.
As much as I spent time with engineers, I'm sorry, but the moment you start talking about API calls, I'm gone. Like,
oh, we know, it's fine. Don't blame
you need to start just talking about like colors. Start just talking about like gray color scales, and I'll be back.
You're in.
Yeah.
Oh, have you thought about borders recently? Because I love borders. Oh, nice. Yeah. Was there any other points you wanted to hit on before we sign it all off?
I think that's everything I wanted to chat about.
Nice. Cool. Well, that is all we have time for then. In that case, thanks for listening to our podcast. We'll be back for another episode in about a month's time.